This is Justice Insight Cam. Watch authentic interactions between citizens and police captured strictly on bodycams. We elevate the viewing experience by exploring the strict legalities, hidden truths, and vital lessons of each event. Let's examine the mechanics of justice.
The first sound is not the judge's voice. It's the soft click of a courtroom screen waking up. A blue glow spills across polished wood. Across the aisle, a man in a pressed suit keeps his chin lifted like he's sitting through a meeting he didn't schedule. In the gallery, people shift in their seats, quiet as if the room itself is listening. And at the plaintiff's table, a young woman, late 20s, early 30s, stares at a single folder in front of her, like it's heavier than any object should be. Inside that folder are years. Years of accidents. Years of bruises explained away as clumsiness. Years of pain that never had a clean story. For a long time, the only person who knew what happened behind closed doors was the child who lived there. Now, in open court, with strangers watching, she is about to do something her younger self never thought was possible. She's going to prove it, not with a dramatic confession, not with a shaky viral video, with paper, with medical records, with dates, triage notes, injury diagrams, physician observations, cold clinical lines that don't care who her father is. And in the next 45 minutes, those lines will become the spine of a case that ends with a number so big it sounds unreal. $3 million. Not as a prize, as a price. So stay with me, because this isn't just a courtroom story. It's a story about how violence hides in plain sight, how families learn to speak in code, and how sometimes the only way out is to turn the secret into a record. And before we get into it, if you care about real-world stories where the truth has to fight its way into the light, tap like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this one touches every kind of neighborhood. Now, let's go back to where the secret started, because secrets like this don't begin with a punch. They begin with a rule. A rule the child learns before she learns long division. Don't talk, don't make him angry. Don't give anyone a reason to look too closely. Her name, for the sake of this story, is Maya. Not because that's the name printed on the complaint, but because her name could be anyone's. A daughter with a life now. A job, friends who think they know her story. But growing up, Maya's world was one house with two versions of reality. The outside version was clean. Lawn cut, curtains straight, family photos lined up in frames like proof of stability. Her father, Daniel, had a reputation. The kind of reputation that makes other adults smile when they say your last name. He was reliable, he volunteered, he showed up, and when he spoke, people listened. Inside the house, the rules were different. Inside the house, anger had footsteps. You could hear it before you saw it. A drawer slammed too hard. A cabinet door closed like it was being punished. Silence, thick and sharp, before the storm. Maya learned to read the air, to predict the temperature of a room, to become small because small felt safer. The first time she ended up in a doctor's office, she was 8. It was the kind of clinic that smells like disinfectant and printer paper. The kind where the waiting room has magazines from 2 years ago and a fish tank that no one cleans as often as they should. Her mother told the receptionist it was a fall, a tumble on the stairs. Kids are kids. Maya sat on the chair with her hands tucked under her thighs so nobody would see them shaking. The nurse asked routine questions. How did this happen? Maya looked at her mother. Her mother smiled too quickly. Maya said what she'd been taught to say. I fell. That's the first way abuse survives. It recruits the victim into its own cover story. And to the outside world, that day became a small note in a file. Bruising, swelling, pain level, discharge instructions. The second time, she was 10. A different injury, a different excuse. The third time, she was 12. The fourth time, 14. And each visit, each urgent care form, each school nurse report, each one was a single brick. On its own, it looked like an accident, but stacked over years, it started to resemble something else. A pattern. Daniel's control wasn't constant. That's another thing people misunderstand. They imagine violence as daily, obvious, cinematic. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's seasonal. It spikes when money is tight, when a job is lost, when a partner threatens to leave, when a child becomes old enough to have opinions. Maya's father could go weeks being charming, laughing at dinner, asking about school. Then one night, something tiny would set him off. A dish left in the sink, a grade that wasn't perfect, a tone in her voice he didn't like, and the house would change. The air would narrow. Even the lights would feel brighter, harsher. He didn't always leave marks where people could see. That's what secret meant. Not invisible, just hidden. Under sleeves, under hair, under the kind of silence that learns to smile. Maya tried, once, to tell someone at school. She was 13. There was a health class unit about safe adults. A teacher said, "If anything makes you feel unsafe at home, you can talk to us." Maya raised her hand halfway, then stopped, because she could already hear her father's voice in her head. "Who would believe you? Do you want to ruin this family? Do you want your mother to suffer?" And besides, her father wasn't just a man. He was a man with a reputation, and reputations are armor. So Maya didn't tell, not clearly, not in a way that made an adult call the police. She did what a lot of kids do. She tried to survive the days. She got good at excuses. She became the kid who wore hoodies in warm weather, the kid who laughed too hard at jokes, the kid who flinched when someone moved too fast. And the years passed, which is what secrets depend on. Time. Because time changes the body. Bruises fade, bones heal. And time changes the memory too. Trauma doesn't store itself like a neat file. It stores itself like broken glass, fragments, sounds, smells, the exact way a door looks when it's about to close, the exact tone a voice takes before it becomes dangerous. Maya left home at 18. College, community college, a roommate's couch, whatever it was out. Leaving didn't fix everything. Leaving never does. Leaving just changes what the pain looks like. Instead of bruises, there were panic attacks. Instead of hiding marks, she hid insomnia. Instead of flinching at footsteps in a hallway, she flinched when her phone buzzed. Because Daniel still had control in other ways. He could call, he could show up, he could threaten, and most of all, he could deny. There's a particular kind of cruelty in denial. Not a loud denial, a calm one. The kind that looks you in the eyes and says, "That never happened," like your childhood is a rumor. For years, Maya carried a private question that ate at her from the inside. If it was real, why can't I prove it? Then something happened that changed the shape of her silence. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a screaming match. It was a letter, a formal letter with a firm logo and polite language, informing Maya that her father had been nominated for a community award, a recognition for mentorship, for youth outreach, for being a pillar. Maya read it twice, then she read it again, and she felt something in her chest that wasn't just anger. It was nausea, because the world was about to reward the person who made her life a private war. And she realized if she stayed quiet, she wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting him. That is the moment in many stories like this when silence becomes impossible. Not because the fear disappears, because the cost of staying quiet finally becomes higher than the cost of speaking. Maya called a therapist, not because she thought therapy would lead to court, but because she needed to breathe again. In those first sessions, the words came out slowly. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't. Then one day she said it. My father used to hit me. and the room didn't collapse. The therapist didn't look away. The therapist didn't say, "Are you sure?" The therapist said something simple. "I'm sorry that happened to you." It shouldn't have been revolutionary, but for Maya, it was, because it was the first time an adult responded as if the truth mattered more than the family's image. That's when the next question arrived. What would it take to hold him accountable? The therapist didn't give legal advice. Therapy isn't court. But the therapist did something important. She asked, "Have you ever looked at your medical history?" Maya blinked. "Why?" "Because," the therapist said, carefully, "sometimes the body remembers on paper." That's a strange phrase, but it's true. Hospitals keep records, clinics keep records, school nurses keep records, and those records don't always tell the full story, but they tell enough to start building one. So Maya did something that felt both simple and terrifying. She started asking for copies. It began with a request form, then another, then another. Some offices required a fee, some required in-person ID, some had moved to digital portals, some had merged, closed, changed names. And each time Maya filled out paperwork, she felt like she was digging up her own bones. The first batch arrived in a thick envelope. Maya opened it on her kitchen table. The pages smelled like toner. She flipped through them with the careful dread of someone reading their own autopsy. There it was, age 8. Contusion, swelling, patient quiet. Age 10, bruising inconsistent with stated mechanism. That line stopped her. Inconsistent, not a verdict, not an accusation, but a doubt. A medical professional, years ago, had noticed. Maybe they couldn't prove it. Maybe they didn't have enough, but they had noticed. Another record, age 12. Multiple bruises in various stages of healing. Another record, age 14. Patient avoids eye contact. Mother answers most questions. And suddenly, Maya wasn't just remembering. She was seeing her childhood through a lens that didn't belong to her father. Seeing that, even then, the truth had left fingerprints. This is where people often ask a hard question. Why didn't anyone stop it? It's a fair question, but it has an uncomfortable answer. Because suspicion isn't proof. Because mandatory reporting laws exist, but the system is overwhelmed. Because abusers are often skilled at performing normal. Because families move. Because a child saying, "I fell," closes a lot of doors. And because the truth, when it threatens a respected adult, has to fight for oxygen. Maya's records didn't read like a movie. They read like bureaucracy. But that's what made them powerful. They weren't emotional. They were consistent. And consistency is what courts understand. Maya found a civil attorney who handled cases involving childhood abuse. The first meeting wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork, questions, and long pauses. The attorney explained something important. A civil case isn't a criminal trial. In a criminal case, the state has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil case, the standard is usually lower, more like proving it's more likely than not. That doesn't make it easy. It just changes the map. The attorney also explained something else. Timing. Some states have extended windows, look-back windows, where survivors can file civil claims even years later. Other states have strict limits. Maya's situation, in this story, fell into a window that allowed her to sue. But even with permission to file, she still had to do the hardest thing. She had to put her name on paper and accuse her father. Not in a private therapy session, in a public document. That step changes families, even before a judge ever sees the case. Because once the complaint is filed, the secret is no longer protected by silence. It becomes a question with a case number. Daniel was served on a Tuesday. Maya didn't see it happen, but she pictured it anyway. A knock, a stranger handing him an envelope. The moment his reputation took a breath and realized it might not survive. He called her that night. She didn't answer. He texted, You're doing this for money. You're sick. You'll regret it." Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped the phone. Not because she believed him, because her nervous system recognized his voice as a threat. That's the thing about trauma. Even when your mind chooses truth, your body still reacts like the past is happening now. The case moved forward the way civil cases do, slowly, through motions, through deadlines, through discovery. Maya handed over medical records. Her attorney requested Daniel's records too. Anything relevant. Depositions were scheduled. In a deposition room, there's no jury. Just lawyers, a court reporter, and the pressure of being asked questions about the worst parts of your life, while someone types every word. Maya sat under fluorescent lights that made everything feel unreal. She was asked to describe incidents, not in a sweeping, emotional way, in a legal way. Where were you standing? What time of day? What did you say? What did he do? And the defense attorney did what defense attorneys often do. They looked for cracks, they asked about dates, they asked about inconsistencies, they implied exaggeration, they implied revenge, they implied instability. Maya answered anyway. Not perfectly, but honestly, and whenever her memory blurred, she leaned on what the records could anchor. Because paper doesn't shake, paper doesn't dissociate, paper doesn't go silent in fear. Daniel's deposition was different. He denied everything. Not angrily, smoothly. He spoke like a man who had practiced his innocence in the mirror. She was a difficult child. She made things up. Her mother was dramatic. She fell a lot. He turned her bruises into clumsiness. He turned her fear into attitude. He turned her childhood into an unreliable narrator. And if Maya's case had relied only on memory versus denial, that might have been the end. But it wasn't, because the records didn't just show injuries. They showed repetition. They showed medical professionals noting concern. They showed the same household showing up again and again with a child, and an explanation that never quite fit. Then came the additional pieces, a school counselor note, retrieved from an archived district file, about Maya appearing withdrawn, about frequent unexplained injuries, about fearful reaction to parent contact, a neighbor's statement about hearing shouting late at night, a former friend's memory of Maya changing in the locker room, turning her body away, avoiding questions, a relative who admitted quietly that they'd suspected something but never thought it was that bad. None of this alone was perfect, but together it built what the law often requires: corroboration. In other words, a story that keeps telling the same truth from different angles. Daniel's attorneys tried to keep the medical records out. They argued relevance. They argued that injuries don't prove who caused them, and they weren't wrong about the second part. A bruise doesn't come labeled with a name, but the judge allowed them in. Because the point wasn't that the records identified Daniel like a fingerprint. The point was that the records made Maya's story harder to dismiss as fantasy. They showed that something was happening, something frequent, something suspicious, and now, for the first time, Daniel had to answer, not just a daughter, he had to answer a timeline. As the trial approached, settlement talks began. That's common. Most civil cases don't go all the way to a verdict, but this one did, because Maya wanted more than money. She wanted acknowledgement. And Daniel, from what we can infer in this kind of case, wanted the opposite. He wanted the story to disappear. The morning of trial, the courthouse felt like a place built for quiet conflict. The hallways smelled like old carpet and coffee. People moved with purpose but avoided eye contact. Maya sat on a bench outside the courtroom, hands wrapped around a paper cup she wasn't drinking. Her attorney sat beside her. Across the hall, Daniel sat with his lawyers, smiling slightly at someone who greeted him. That smile was a message. I belong here. Maya's name was called. They walked in, the jury filed into their seats, and the case began. Opening statements are where stories become weapons. Maya's attorney spoke about a child trapped in a house that looked normal. A child who learned to lie to survive. A child who went to doctors and came home to the same danger. Then Daniel's attorney stood and painted a different picture. A bitter adult, a family dispute, a lawsuit fueled by money. And this is where, if you're watching, you might already feel the tension, because it's the oldest fight in abuse cases. A survivor says, "Believe me." An accused person says, "Prove it." The first witnesses were not dramatic. A records custodian, a nurse, a doctor who had no memory of Maya as a person, only a chart. That, again, is what made it powerful. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't revenge, it was routine documentation. A physician testified about typical injury patterns, about how bruises from falls often appear in certain places, about how bruises from impact can appear in others, about defensive injuries, marks consistent with someone trying to shield themselves. The doctor didn't say, "Your father did this." The doctor said, "This pattern raised concern." Maya's attorney displayed a timeline, not with gruesome images, with dates, clinic visit, school nurse, urgent care, ER. Over and over. The jury watched the pattern build like a storm line on radar. Then Maya testified, "This is the part people imagine as a speech. It's not. It's questions and answers. Sometimes the answers are only a sentence long." Maya described the rules, the threats, the ways her father could switch from normal to dangerous. She described how she learned to cover bruises, how she learned to say, "I fell," how she learned to keep her voice steady in doctor's offices. And when she talked about the fear, she didn't oversell it. She didn't need to. Because the fear was in the details. The way she knew exactly where the creaky floorboard was so she could avoid it. The way she could tell how angry he was by how he closed a door. The way she became an expert at predicting weather in a house. During cross-examination, the defense tried to rattle her. They asked why she didn't report sooner. They asked why there were no police reports. They asked why she kept visiting home during college. They asked why she didn't cut him off completely. These questions can sound reasonable to people who have never lived inside coercion. But coercion doesn't release you just because you turn 18. Fear doesn't care about birthdays, and families, especially ones that look perfect from the outside, have gravity. Maya answered. She said she was scared. She said she didn't think anyone would believe her. She said she was trying to protect her mother. And then she said something that shifted the room. She said, "I spent years believing it didn't count because it wasn't visible to everyone else." That's the quiet lie abuse teaches. If nobody saw it, it didn't happen. Then the timeline came back. The records, the notes, the concerns, and suddenly the jury didn't have to rely on perfect memory. They had a map. Daniel testified near the end. He played the role he had always played. The father, the provider, the man being attacked. He denied. He suggested Maya was unstable. He implied she was manipulated by lawyers. He described her as dramatic, difficult, ungrateful. And that language mattered, because when an accused parent reaches for character assassination, it often reveals more than they intend. Not proof, but posture, a willingness to explain harm by blaming the harmed. Then came the moment from the cold open. The screen, the folder, the medical timeline projected for the jury in one long, unbroken line. It wasn't one bruise, it was years. And when the attorney highlighted the note, inconsistent with stated mechanism, the room shifted. You could feel it, not like a gasp, like a collective recalculation, as if people who had been uncertain suddenly had to admit, someone noticed. Someone back then saw enough to write it down. And writing it down is a kind of witness. Closing arguments were the final collision. Maya's attorney asked the jury to consider the cost of growing up in fear. Not just pain, but lost safety. Lost normal. lost childhood. They asked the jury to consider the courage it took to bring this case, to say, publicly, this happened. Daniel's attorney asked the jury to protect him from an unproven accusation, to reject what they framed as a money grab. And then the jury left. Deliberations are where stories wait. Maya sat in a small room with her attorney, staring at the same wall for so long it started to blur. She didn't know if she would win. She didn't know if she could survive losing, because losing wouldn't just be a legal outcome. It would feel like her childhood being erased again. After hours, sometimes it's longer, sometimes shorter, the bailiff opened the door. Jury has reached a verdict. Maya walked back into the courtroom on legs that didn't feel like her own. The jurors filed in, the foreperson held a paper, the judge asked the question, and the answer came: liability, damages, $3 million. In that moment, Maya didn't cheer. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry like a movie. She exhaled, a long, shaking exhale like her body had been holding its breath for 20 years. Daniel's face changed, not into rage, into something colder, disbelief, as if the world had violated a rule he thought was permanent, a rule that said, I get to be untouchable. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions. Maya didn't answer all of them. She didn't owe anyone a performance. Her attorney spoke in careful phrases: accountability, evidence, justice. Maya stood beside them, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the cameras. Because winning doesn't undo. It doesn't give you back the years. It doesn't erase the nights. What it does, when it works, is something quieter. It changes the official story. It takes the secret and forces it into the public record. And for many survivors, that is the first real interruption of the abuser's power. The aftermath wasn't clean. It never is. Daniel appealed, as defendants often do. Or he threatened to. Family members took sides. Some called Maya brave. Some called her a traitor. Some said they didn't want to get involved, which is another way of saying they didn't want to choose truth over comfort. Maya's mother, depending on the reality of cases like this, might have been conflicted. Love tangled with guilt, fear tangled with denial. It's possible her mother apologized. It's also possible she didn't. Both outcomes are common, because abuse doesn't just harm the victim, it warps the entire family system. Maya used some of the money for therapy, for medical care, for the kind of stability she didn't have growing up. But the most important thing she bought wasn't a car or a house. It was distance. Distance from the person who trained her nervous system to live on alert. And with distance, she started to notice the small ways the past still lived in her. The way she apologized too quickly. The way she feared mistakes like they were crimes. The way she felt guilty for resting. Those are the leftover fingerprints of control. And healing, for her, wasn't a straight line. It was waves. Some days she felt strong, some days she felt 8 again. But now, when the doubt arrived, when the old voice tried to whisper, maybe it wasn't real, she had something to answer with. Not just memory, evidence, a legal finding, a jury's decision, a record that didn't belong to her father. Now here's the part that always splits people. Some will say, money can't fix trauma. That's true. Some will say, people lie for money. That's also sometimes true. But the existence of false claims doesn't erase real ones. And what made this case different, what pushed it into that rare category of accountability, was the way the truth had been documented long before anyone thought about a lawsuit. The records weren't created to win. They were created to treat, which is why they carried weight. If you're watching this and thinking, how many stories never reach a courtroom? That's the right question, because most don't. Some never have records. Some never have windows to file. Some never have money for lawyers. Some never have the emotional bandwidth to relive the worst parts of their lives under cross-examination. So when a case like this ends with a verdict, it's not just about one family. It's about a system finally being forced to say, the harm mattered. And it's about something else too. It's about the way secrets depend on our collective discomfort. Because people like Daniel don't survive on strength alone. They survive on everyone else's reluctance to see. On the neighbor who hears shouting and tells themselves it's none of their business. On the teacher who notices a bruise but doesn't want to accuse the wrong parent. On the family member who suspects but stays silent because holidays are easier that way. That's how secret beatings become possible. Not because they're invisible, because they're inconvenient. And here's the final truth Maya's case forces us to face. A child can be harmed for years in a house that looks normal. A respected adult can be dangerous in private. And the body sometimes is the only witness that never lies. So I want to ask you something, genuinely. If you were on that jury and you saw years of records forming a pattern, would you feel confident making the call? And if you were a neighbor, a teacher, a coach, someone who noticed small signs, would you step in? Or would you tell yourself it's probably nothing? Drop your answer in the comments, because the way we respond to these stories shapes what happens in the next house, on the next street, in the next perfect family photo. And remember the moment we started with the courtroom screen lighting up. A folder opened, a timeline revealed. That wasn't just evidence, it was a life finally allowed to be real. Not whispered, not minimized, not denied. Real. And sometimes, that's the first kind of justice a survivor ever gets.
We value your viewership. Should you find this investigative report helpful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Justice Insight Cam. Keep a watchful eye, stay safe, and join us for the next compelling story.